Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast and/or video series for your ears, where we talk about designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I design miniature games such as Gaslands and A Billion Suns and others. This is my friend and colleague Glenn Ford. Hello, Glenn.
Hello.
He also designs miniature games almost as compulsively as myself, as well as designing card and board games, many of which have been available through Kickstarter. And you should always check Mano Kent Games to find out what he's up to, because he's always up to many things. Now, we most recently had a conversation about probably my favorite element of the possible physical randomizing objects of tabletop miniature games, which is cards. And we talked about all the lovely affordances that cards provide to you as the designer, all the hooks that they give you to hook your design onto. And I think in this conversation, we're going to talk about the uses of them. So how do you actually take those affordances and wire them into your game designs for tabletop miniatures games? And I think in the previous conversation, it might have felt a little bit like we were talking about cards mostly as sort of random number generators and resources. And I think we're gonna demonstrate that as I'm sure, gentle listener, you're well aware that the uses of cards in games are much more broad than that. And of course, you can use them in lots of different ways in a single design as well. Yeah, so I've got a big list of ones to go through here, so that's what I kind of propose.
I'm gonna take 1 second just because we chatted about all the wonderful affordances that cards can give you that dice can't, and some of them I think are sort of double-edged swords, like whether or not a deck of cards has memory. I just want to say that there are two things that you definitely can't do with decks of cards that is probably worth just mentioning and bearing in mind in relation to them. I think the first thing about a deck of cards is that they do have more of a flat. You can't do 2d6 in a way that people can instantly recognize probabilities with a deck of cards. At best, you can say flip out 2 cards and add them together, but that ends up having because it's got so much affordance, it can be hard for people to wrap their heads around. So it can be hard to create a bell curve in an efficient and an easy way.
Please, Your Honor, I would present to you the game of blackjack in defense of that. So I think you can, and you do it. You just said 2d6, where you can do 2 cards, and 2 cards provides you with a probability curve.
But I think the issue is that it's a probability curve that most players don't instantly and naturally understand in the way that
that's probably true, unless they're blackjack players. Yeah.
And yes, and they are. Yeah, and even then it is. And then in that case, you are locked into the fact that all of your picture cards are 10s.
Right, which is one possible affordance and option that you have.
Yeah. So I think it's a little trickier to create a
and that in itself, I think, is one of the interesting probability spikes that you can put in, because as we talked about, you can have the numbers 1 to 10 or 1 to 11 or 1 to 14, but if you have all your picture cards as 10, then you have 4 10s, or if you have an ace, you have 5 10s, and so you can weight the distribution of numbers into a specific place, which is weird, and you can't do that with dice as easily or as naturally.
And I think probably one of the big split points on whether or not you would want to use cards or not is that it's really hard to do the equivalent of rolling 20 dice with cards. You can obviously find different ways of achieving the probability flattening things that a dice pool has, but if you're playing a mass battle game where you want to have 1 model able to shoot and also want to have 40 models able to shoot simultaneously, you're probably going to want to go with dice. And that is I know that's one point that's a teensy bit sort of splitting, where you're like, okay, well, occasionally I want 20 guys to shoot, and I can't ask people to flip 20 cards Whereas I also want to have one guy shoot, so I'm probably going to end up going with dice. But other than those two sort of, I think, minor caveats, yes, let's move on to the other things that you can do with cards.
So we talked about randomness.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a bit about resources. So cards can be held by people, given to people, passed between people. They can be used to generate random events. So that could be, you know, rooms in a dungeon crawl, or wandering monsters, or, you know, what the weather is like. Or they can be used as sort of chance cards. So you can give people random little bonuses. They can be used for setup. So, you know, Games Workshop sells decks of cards for you to procedurally generate your game. So you can accelerate the game setup or a scenario generation.
I wonder, because it's something that you don't see, and I genuinely don't know how well this would work physically, but obviously one of the things that's interesting about dice is, like, so scatter dice, for example, are about, you know, you roll them on tabletop and they physically point one way or another. I'm just thinking, you can't really have scatter cards because you can't flip a card onto the tabletop and have it point randomly in a given direction as easily. But of course, you totally could. You totally could have somebody flick a card onto the tabletop and see where it lands, or you could spin a card like spinning a bottle and see which direction it points in. I genuinely don't know how workable physically that would be, but this is the sort of thing for people to sort of maybe hunker into and start testing out and see what happens when you use a card to generate the equivalence of a scatter dice.
Yeah. Other things that cards are very, very commonly used for is quick reference. So, you know, unit stat cards, spell cards, you know, literally like the turn order, all of that stuff I think is a really useful use of cards. And when I'm playtesting my games and making cards, those are often the first ones that I'm making, because I want to have the information in front of me in a way that's laid out flat and horizontally and doesn't require me to flip through the book. They can be used to power victory conditions. That could be because you're holding secret objective cards, or because, like in A Billion Suns, they're used to generate the scoring mechanics. We talked about the fact that they can be used as measuring devices. My favorite two examples of that are Pirates of the Spanish Main, which is the little pop-out ship construction game that shipped with every little card that the ship popped out of a thing, and then you could use the empty frame as the widget for measuring.
Love that game so hard. It's just there's the spaceship equivalent of it that they do, the 1950s spaceship sort of theme thing. Love that
rocket something.
Yeah. Wish that game was still sort of being supported and more popular.
And of course, there's the Osprey game, Kobolds and Cobblestones, which uses a very similar idea. And I think it's neat. I think it's really tidy. You can use them for, as well as quick reference, you can use them for sort of list building and upgrades, which is kind of a combination of quick reference cards and list building, where, for example, in X-Wing, you know, you've got a deck of pilots, you've got separate decks of upgrades, and that makes the list building process quite a physical and tactile thing, and results in a little dashboard in front of you of all the stuff that you've got. That's pretty cool.
Super quickly, for people who are like considering using decks of cards of some kind or another in their playtesting, there's a little resource, a program available free online called Nandeck. Might pop a link into it, which really can speed up the production of prototype decks of cards, where you can tweak something and it'll change the deck of cards for you and reformat it for you very, very quickly. So we might pop a link to access.
An even lower tech version of that is if you get a PowerPoint deck or a Google Slides deck, and you lay out 8 little squares, and you'll need to mess about a little bit to test how to get it right. But you can quite quickly lay out 8 card shapes, which are roughly the right size to slide into standard card sleeves. And then you can just use, just throw text in there using the standard text things. And then when you print those out, you can cut them out with scissors or a knife and slide them into card protectors. And if you want to get fancy, you can, because you've got 4 columns of 2 cards, you can print the text one way and then below upside down, fold that over like a clamshell, slide that in, and that's a very fast way to create 2-sided playtesting things. If you need that. I end my literally my office here is just like every cranny is stuffed with old playtest cards that are from various iterations of various games.
Yeah. If you want to sort of see some interesting ways of putting together cards and decks of cards at home, you can always check out the Board Game Geek Print and Play Guild. There are people who do this fairly sort of regularly and obsessively, and there are lots of little tricks and tips to get a deck of cards looking nice and professional very quickly onto the tabletop for testing and prototyping.
So some other uses, in the last conversation I briefly mentioned deck building or like list building. So Warhammer Underworlds is an example of a game which sort of mashes together the tabletop miniatures world of games with a sort of slightly more collectible card game style of, well, I want my army, I want my stuff to do a certain thing, so I'm going to combine a certain number of abilities into a little deck of cards. I think that's an interesting mechanic which is predominantly less accessible to particularly the independent game designer, where I would need to produce quite a lot of product in order for that to function. But there's ways potentially of doing that on a smaller scale. Although the smaller scale you do it, the more I think it looks like, list building upgrade type stuff. I guess it's worth saying that lots of skirmish games, of course, use unit stat cards or character cards, and those can be, they can be record sheets as well. Particularly, I've got in the habit of sticking them into card sheets, card protectors, and using dry white markers. Others will use pencils. Others will just print them out and discard them after the game. But that's really cool. That provides a piece of user interface right there on the table. And I know that's not maybe strictly speaking kind of using cards instead of dice, but I think once you've got your handle on prototyping games with cards, and maybe the best way to offer print and play cards to your player base, then I think just a lot of cool options open up for you.
And I think that once you've got the idea of using playing cards physically, in particularly in relation to sort of the physicality of putting them out on the tabletop, you can mix that in more easily with cards that are for units. I mean, one of the things about playing cards is that they can cover each other, and if you have got cards representing units, you can cover those units with playing cards, and you can not know which unit is underneath which card or which card you've noted to each unit. It's one thing placing cards out on the tabletop next to models. It's another if you can tuck them into or next to a set of cards off to the edge of the tabletop and then reveal them at various points, or have a unit carrying a card round with it for later use, sort of by connecting the geographical sort of thing of, okay, there's a model there, which is also this card over to one side, which I'm also going to cover, tuck under, or attach to playing cards at various points.
Yeah, and sort of bouncing off that, like you can use them for marking secret orders. So it's easy to imagine a command phase where you have to lay out, suits to indicate whether they're charging or defending or retreating or shooting or whatever. And for example, in the Gaslands sort of spin-off Martian Racing Federation, which is in Blaster 1. I use them to plan out a movement phase. So much like Robot Rally, you kind of secretly decide where you're going to move to and reveal the cards. And so that kind of programming of a unit, whether that's a single order or a sequence of things, that's kind of a cool use for them as well. Yeah, I think without going too much deeper into each of those things, I think that's broadly. Oh, and you can use them as a deployment thing as well. So you can use them, as we were talking about, you can use them to mark physical areas, or you can use them as a marker for a point and measure around that. So it can be used to sort of trigger or control where deployment is happening. So I guess, should we talk a little bit about playing cards versus custom cards?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're asking people to use a set of custom cards of some kind or another, you're massively upping the barrier to entry for people.
Yep.
And you're probably going to need to put more of your own resources into assisting people to deal with that.
And I think I would make a specific distinction here between if you are requiring, if your rules require a deck of cards which functions like a deck of cards, i.e. it's pretty difficult to tell one card from another and they have to be basically ubiquitous from one side, I think that's quite a heavy print and play lift for most players. If you're just saying, hey, print out these quick reference sheets or print out these record sheets, and it sort of doesn't matter whether you got them the right side or the wrong size, and it sort of doesn't matter if they're a bit rubbish to look at because you're going to scribble on them and throw them away, I think that's a much lower ask for people.
Yeah. If you're basically asking people to generate a bunch of small character sheets or reference cards, that's not too bad. Especially because at the absolute minimum, people can just get a bit of paper and write out the things that you've told them to know on those bits of paper.
Yeah.
If you require something that functions like a deck of cards, if you're not physically printing and providing that, then sleeves are the only way that most people can achieve that at home without like.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a fairly advanced, or it's a subset of gamers that grok that.
Yeah, you're going to have to you're requiring a lot more of people. What you can do, I think, more easily is ask people to build a relatively custom deck out of pre-existing decks. So the super easy way of achieving something that is close to the game mechanics of a custom deck is say to somebody, okay, get a normal deck of playing cards, but you take 30 cards out of that deck of cards, and your force boosts off of pulling clubs and spades, or has certain benefits where low cards are good or high cards are good, or etc. etc. And then you can get a lot of the mechanics out of what you might normally want to be doing with a custom deck of cards without putting a huge weight on people to get a custom deck of cards. You lose some of your affordances because you've generally got to have fewer cards than would be in a normal deck, but it does give you some options to do some very interesting things and let people deck build and flip cards randomly, which is hard to do otherwise and is interesting to engage with, certainly.
And we're talking about this from a fairly indie specific perspective. Like, Glenn, you have produced games through Kickstarter, through Chinese manufacturers with decks of absolutely fabulous quality cards. The most recent Blaster issue had a tank game from Joey Maguire where we sold a separate deck of cards which you don't need to play, but they make the game experience nicer, and that's because Drive-Thru offers decks of cards as custom products. But even if you're working for Fantasy Flight or Games Workshop, like, there's another big consideration, which is it's another thing that I have to acquire in order to play the game. And frankly, for me, in lots of cases, like I'll have purchased a rule book or a boxed game, and I need this deck of cards, but that product is out of stock in the place that I'm buying this from. So what you have to give some considerations to, like, what happens if a player can't acquire one of these decks, and the fact that it's another SKU that you have to worry about keeping in stock and getting in the player's hands. So I think from that perspective, the custom decks can be a bit more of a logistical headache if you're trying to get a product into the player's hands. As indie designers, we try and package things up as much as possible as a single volume that maybe even can be just given digitally. And you can tuck those custom cards as leafs at the back of that PDF and ask people to print them off, but then it gets to all the things that we've just been talking about. I guess that's a very similar consideration to custom dice. I have lost track of the number of times I've gone, ooh, that's a Saga Force that I'd like to play. Let me go and get those. Oh, those dice are out of stock.
Yeah. I think the thing with custom dice is it's relatively easy to create a table that maps a D6 to a custom D6.
Right.
It's a logistical nightmare to create a similar table that maps a deck of cards to a custom deck of cards.
In a way that a human could practically use. It's impossible.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other part, and this is a little bit more of like this is less of an indie concern, but I think it's more of like a sort of big industry concern, is are you creating a pay to win model in your game design, in the product design that your game sits within? So I think it's fairly fair to ask questions of games like X-Wing or like Underworlds, where acquiring the maximum number of options, and therefore likely the best power in your list, requires you to purchase a certain number of products. And so the more products you purchase in a product line, perhaps the better you're going to be able to function in that game. And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about that.
Yeah, I think that huge questions to be asked about requiring that of a player. And I think that,
and I think actually, I don't intend to demonize either Fantasy Flight or Games Workshop, because in both cases with X-Wing, they've provided easy ways to acquire a large selection of cards very quickly without buying expensive miniatures. Similarly, with Underworlds, they've released decks of essential cards so that everybody can like level up to the same kind of basic or important sets of equipment. So there's ways of dealing with it, but I think it's a concern, it's a consideration.
Yes, it's something to think about, and it's something to think about when the thing you're providing is maybe not as ubiquitous as the thing that GW or Fantasy Flight would be providing. It's Fantasy Flight and GW can just provide one of these decks of cards, and then, as you say, everyone can get a hold of them.
Even then.
Well, yeah, no, quite. Whereas if you're a little indie, you probably can't control how rare some of your cards might end up being if you're physically producing them, because you just don't have that reach to put them out and make them available to absolutely everybody.
And then I guess we haven't really talked about it, but if you've got custom cards and you're using them as a random deck of things, like, my goodness, you can put anything you like on that. You can have different numbers, you can have special rules, you can split the card in two so that it's usable in one scenario and it's differently usable in another scenario. You can have it as, it can have an action and a reaction. It can have, effects that stack up. It can have effects that connect to other kind of keywords across those cards. Like, all of the loveliness that's available in kind of card game design, proper board game card game design, I think then opens up to you, and it allows you to wire the front of that card into any of the systems that you've designed in the game. I'm not sure that goes, that needs to be said, that there's a lot of possibilities that you can then wire in. I think potentially some of that design space ends up making the game feel more like a board game. And because it requires all the problems of custom cards, I think it's not been seen as much. A game like Warhammer Underworlds, I think, is probably the one of the most advanced examples of this. But it'd be interesting to see more games using the huge possibility space of that front of the custom card to wire into a different set of tabletop miniature kind of options.
And it has to be said, decks of cards are pretty ubiquitous and generally very cheap, and marker pens that can write onto cards are equally very ubiquitous and very, very cheap. And I think because cards haven't been sort of utilized in an enormous amount in these sorts of games, there isn't a lot of sort of looking into the thing of going, okay, get a deck of cards, get a marker pen, you can write this on X many of the cards in your deck, you can write this on X many of the cards in your deck, you can, in a very, very physical, immediate and tactile way, actually deck build. You can get people to literally sort of create a custom deck. We ask people to create custom models and do a whole bunch of hobby at home and write lists and all these sorts of things. You can't ask people to get a dice and write, when the 6 comes up for this unit, blah blah happens. You can totally do that with a deck of cards. And I think again,
that's a great point. There's a game that I have in my files, which I cannot repeat the name of on television, which it starts from the perspective that if a deck of cards is so inexpensive, then what I'm going to ask you to do is get a deck of cards and deface it. And it has a sort of legacy element to it. But by defacing that deck of cards and by making it your deck of cards for that particular force, like that feels like because that game was particularly about sort of antisocial acts of defiance, and so destroying a deck of cards permanently for the purpose of playing this game was quite thematically linked. But I also think, as you point out, like we spend lots of money on models that we clip the heads off and then get discarded because they were conversion pieces. It's like 4 or 5 quid for a deck of cards. Why shouldn't that be a consumed resource that then becomes an intrinsic sort of destructed part of your force? And I think that could be really cool, whether that's with stickers, whether that's with marker pens and biros, whether that's by tearing things up or tearing pieces off the cards to mark them. Like there's a lot of fun.
My local pound shop does them for 50p a deck, so I'd be pretty happy to carve them up.
I'm paying too much for my decks of cards.
I definitely think that there's definitely an option to be like, okay, this deck of cards is my Goblin Army deck. I've gone through and I've marked it out and I've written on it and I've sort of list built for that deck, and then this one is my elf deck, and etc etc. I think there's a huge set of very satisfying options available there, but again, this is a fairly unexplored area of design here.
And one of the things that's surprising if you're not super interested in playing cards, I think one of the things that is surprising is, holy cow, are there a lot of decks of cards in the world, and a lot of people who collect decks of cards, and so there are a lot of people who make collectible decks of cards in a billion different themes in order to satisfy that need. And so sort of like in a similar way to when I was writing Gaslands, I didn't realize the depth of the like toy car custom modeling sub sort of community. Writing a lovely result of writing decks of playing cards into your game is that you create, as I did with A Billion Suns, this really interesting additional piece of hobby where people can go and find the perfect deck. So people are out there finding the most science fiction-y decks of cards that evoke the sort of era that they are interested in. And so then they can play A Billion Suns with a deck of cards that actually becomes a lovely in-game object that they spent some time researching and finding and is theirs, but is also really it's really in theme. And you can do that with almost anything. Like if you're doing a fantasy game, it could, people can go out and find the goblin deck or the elvish deck, the Lord of the Rings elvish language deck or whatever. Like there's just a billion colorful and inventive and creative decks out there, which creates this whole other sort of fun hobby loop for people.
I think decks are arguably more collectible than dice. They're certainly more physically alterable and manipulatable, if that's a word, than dice. You can extend the hobby into a deck of cards in the way that you can't really extend it into someone's collection of dice. in any kind of sort of intelligent or usable fashion. I think, you know, the number of dice crafting board games that are out there are very minimal and require some very, very custom components. Whereas, as I say, you know, a deck crafting and altering game requires a deck of cards and a marker pen. So it's open to everybody. It's a design option for everybody watching this to consider delving into. And, you know, I would strongly suggest considering, you know, doing that. These are, as I said, these are relatively uncharted waters for these sorts of games. And if you are looking to be an independent games designer and create something to catch people's eye, this is probably the sort of area to consider, you know, throwing your shoulder into and going, okay, you know, this will be the first game that does this or investigates this or offers this to people to catch people's eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has worked in the past. Last piece of sort of practical advice from me. When I started using playing cards in my design, I think the simplest thing to do is to get an old pack of playing cards and a pack of plain stickers, and you just stick a blank sticker onto the face of every card, and then you have a canvas on which to sketch. And I know you've done the same thing for yours. So I talked a little bit about creating templates and doing it digitally and printing them out and cutting them out. That's lovely. You'll get to that. But if you just need to get going tomorrow, just go to the stationers, get pack of cards, pack of white stickers, and you're off to the races.
Yeah, I'm just looking over to my left and I can see 15 random cheap decks of cards that are just sitting on the shelf waiting to have stickers stuck on them and things written on them.
Nice.
Because yes, they're easy to pick up. And you know what? If you're throwing out an old game or board game or something of that nature, put the cards into a bit box somewhere and have them available as a set of neatly sort of sized cards that have identical backs, because you never know when that's going to turn up and be useful to you.
Right, well, I think our enthusiastic gushing forth about the wonders of playing cards and their opportunities in tabletop miniature games probably should come to an end.
Yes. I think there's a whole bunch of options and affordances there that we've talked about. If they are useful or right for your game, I think well worth exploring. And I think as always with a lot of these things, it's to say, just don't automatically default to something without thinking about it. Don't default to dice without considering not dice. You know, and I'm not saying you must use cards in all new games in order to be interesting, but I'm saying it's worth considering using them to be interesting.
We'll have to do an episode on what are there other than dice and cards. That's going to be a bit of a more of a barrel scrape.
I really think dominoes have some very strong options to them, and they have genuinely not really been touched. I'm keep looking. I've got a couple of packs of dominoes I keep looking at and stroking my chin in relation to and thinking, what can I do with those? And weirdly, I've got a marbles based war game back on a shelf somewhere, which has a whole bunch of little mechanics of, you get a card and you put the marble on it and you slope it, or you can flick it, or yeah, there are weird worlds and options out there. So there are possibilities. So for now, I think we will sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. If you've watched through to this point, please do like and subscribe. If you've watched through to this point and you have opinions about the best way you've seen a card or card-like object used in a game, maybe you have opinions about the idea of building a specific deck, altering a deck, tweaking it, twiddling it. I know that some people don't like the idea of wrecking up decks of cards or altering them or twisting them. You know, feel free to drop us some rage about the idea of bringing legacy elements into another area of gaming. Drop us comments and feelings and thoughts about playing cards into the comment section. Other than that, please do look us up on social media. We're generally available. But for now, I think we will sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage, and we'll say thank you and goodbye. So, goodbye.